Hi everyone, so this is an extremely unexpected video. I already have another video that's scheduled for upload tonight. It would have the title of my 2022 portfolio losses, and in that video specifically, I think I reported a loss of around negative 13%. And given the current meltdown in the Hong Kong market right now that's transpiring in real time, Alibaba is down at least 6.6%, Meituan down 5%, BYD down 5%, even Tencent is also down 3%. So given the new developments and the new update, my portfolio would probably be down in the north of 17 to 18%. So I do understand that there will definitely be people or audiences that watch my video or subscribe to my channel just to laugh at my returns. Given that fact, they've been laughing for the last 18 months, so I'm not too concerned about it. But I feel like it's the responsible thing to do to essentially update you on what exactly is happening in China and why is there such a huge drawdown. So essentially over the last weekend and even until today morning, which is Monday, there are three main events that transpired which essentially affected the entire Hong Kong and all these big tech companies, etc. So the first thing was the announcement during the weekend where Chinese market regulators disclosed 28 undeclared M&A cases which violated the anti-monopoly law. So M&A is merger and acquisition. So essentially the regulators fined Tencent for 6 million yuan on 12 cases, Alibaba for 2.5 million yuan on 5 cases, and Bilibili 1.5 million on 3 cases. So in one of the comments in the Twitter thread, essentially the fine levied on Alibaba, which is 2.5 million yuan, is equivalent to only 372,000 US dollars, which is chump change and a tiny drip in the ocean. But that's besides the point. I think the most concerning factor is this idea of investor sentiments. People thought that the worst was over, crackdowns were over, maybe regulators and the Chinese government wouldn't touch all these big tech conglomerates anymore. And just last weekend, it seems like they are still going at it, they are still trying to settle the differences. And from what I understand, all these different M&A cases that was recently discovered actually happened back in 2020 and 2021. So they're essentially revisiting old books. Don't look at this crackdown as a binary thing. It's not crackdown on versus crackdown off. It's always on a continuum. And clearly, we have seen a change in terms of the tonality and the aggressiveness of the regulators in terms of this idea of cracking down. And it really takes time for the government to essentially clean up a lot of all these undesirable practices in the business environment. And let's not forget, they're not a mature market, they don't have a matured system. They need time to learn from both each other, both the conglomerates and also the regulators. Event number 2, Macau essentially shut down all its casino for the first time in more than 2 years on Monday, and the city reported 59 new cases. And you can see that a lot of all the casino names or resort names or luxury or entertainment outlet names all tanked by at least a good 5 to 10%. And this is again the entire perpetual lockdowns that China is experiencing. And there is news stating that at 5 p.m. China will be delivering a speech about this entire COVID restrictions and the new stance of the government. So let's look forward to whatever will transpire and what they have to say in the upcoming press conference. And moving on to event number 3, which is quote-unquote the biggest event that happened in China over the last 2 years, especially after the entire lockdown and the pandemic issue. Currently, there's this huge protest going on in Henan, and I'll play a short clip from CNN.
A massive protest over frozen bank deposits turned violent in Zhengzhou in China. Police clashing with demonstrators on Sunday, demonstrators who were angry that some rural banks have kept millions of dollars frozen since April. At the time, the banks said they were upgrading their internal systems, but customers say they've heard nothing from the banks about the matter since then. The protest was among the largest in China since the pandemic. For more on this, I'm joined by CNN's Zhang in Beijing. Extraordinary scenes. What's behind it? What's being done about it?
Michael, indeed such an extraordinary scene to see more than 1,000 people show up on Sunday morning to stage this rare protest in front of the provincial branch of the country's central bank demanding their money back. But that's also why the provincial authorities went to such great lengths, as you mentioned, even tampering with these people's health QR codes, which is such a basic necessity for anyone in China to leave their homes these days. But that effort really failed after a nationwide backlash, which is why this protest eventually took place. place with demonstrators really training their fire at the local authorities, hurling the Chinese national flags and chanting slogans, with some banners accusing the local police of using violence against them and even calling for human rights and the rule of law. But their peaceful tactics really didn't make their protest last that long. After a few hours of standoff, you could see hundreds of local security personnel, many plainclothes agents charging towards this crowd, forcibly removing everyone, including the elderly and children. Anyone who resisted got kicked and punched, some sustaining injuries and got sent to local hospitals, according to some protesters, and most people got taken to nearby makeshift detention centers. But these protesters' actions really have garnered a lot of sympathy and support from around the country, because people feel they could relate to their situation, as these people were mostly low-income people who put their life savings into these banks because of their faith in the country's banking system. But then they, of course, lost almost everything. And their plight is especially being shared because the economy here is being battered by the country's continued zero COVID policies, with a wide range of industries really under growing distress. And this, of course, is also happening in a very sensitive year politically, as Chinese Supreme Leader Xi Jinping is expected to assume a precedent-breaking third term later this year, and his whole legitimacy reputation very much built on this idea of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So this kind of incident's huge embarrassment for him, for sure. That's why we've seen the local authorities there take such extreme actions to suppress this peaceful protest, because they're so worried about a tinderbox situation. They simply do not want to see any sparks that could ignite more anger and frustration, not only in their province, but across China.
So it looks draconian, isn't it? But I think there are a lot more nuances between whatever that's happening in China thus far, and maybe to just keep you guys up to date into whatever that's happening. So essentially, Chinese authorities on Sunday violently dispersed a peaceful protest by hundreds of depositors. So Sunday, if I believe it's US time, it's actually happening in real time, which is Monday in Singapore and China, because we share the same time zone. So actually, since April, which is at least 3 months back, 4 rural banks in China's central Henan province have frozen millions of dollars worth of deposits, threatening the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of customers in an economy already battered by draconian COVID lockdowns. Which is why, when I reflect back to whatever Singapore has instituted and installed into the country itself, it's actually against the law to assemble, it's against the law to protest. If you want to go for a peaceful protest, like however they like to call it, you need to have a license, which goes against the exact idea of protesting, which is quite ironic. But I can understand that why we resulted in that conclusion, because like we all know, quote-unquote peaceful protests at any single country in the world, none of it will result in something peaceful. It will usually result in some sort of violence, and people have to step in, security steps in, police steps in, then to not draw into bad experiences, the military might even need to step in. So it's a whole host of problems, and let's not open that can of worms. So anguished depositors have staged several demonstrations in the city of Zhengzhou and the provincial capital of Henan over the past 2 months, but their demands have invariably fallen on deaf ears. So on Sunday, more than 1,000 depositors from across China gathered outside the Zhengzhou branch of the country's central bank, the People's Bank of China, to launch their largest protest yet. More than half a dozen protesters told CNN. So when I first read this article, I was quite surprised. I was thinking, hey, I was under the impression that PBOC was the one that quote-unquote scammed them and freeze their assets. And then to get the context right, it's actually the 4 rural banks in the Henan province that quote-unquote scammed and paused their withdrawals. So it's not the People's Bank of China. I was willing to even go out and bet like $10,000 that any of all these quote-unquote big banks in China like ICBC, People's Bank of China, regardless of how big a crisis they are in, the government will bail them out. Trust me on this. So the entire framing of this reporting is slightly suspicious, but of course this is my own opinion. Since they can't get any answers from the rural banks, that's why they marched towards the central banks, and in hopes that they want to draw the attention of the central government. So do take note that there is the differences in terms of central government, which is Xi Jinping and his gang, and then there are provincial and local governments, which is whoever that are the state authorities. Very much like how you look at mayors, etc. So the demonstration is among the largest China has seen since the pandemic, with domestic travel limited by various COVID restrictions on movement. Last month, Zhengzhou authorities even resorted to tampering with the country's digital COVID health code system to restrict the movements of depositors and thwart their planned protests, sparking a nationwide outcry. I actually saw the nationwide outcry. It was actually a very hot topic on Baidu and even on WeChat and all the social media platforms like Weibo as well. I believe the investigations are underway by the central government, checking onto the local governments. But if this is really the case and they conclude that there was some sort of tampering and there's some sort of exploitation, this is a clear corruption of the government and something needs to be done. I'm not going to defend the local government saying that, oh, this is in light of trying to protect the people and to maintain peace and harmony in the place. If that's what they did, it's a clear exploitation and manipulation and essentially corruption, and however they're conducting the affairs of the state or the county. So somebody should be held accountable. That's the minimum baseline. So using national flags to display patriotism is a common strategy for protesters in China, where dissent is strictly suppressed. The tactic is meant to show that their grievances are only against local governments and that they support and rely on the central government to seek redress, which is however I described. In a lot of these day-to-day operations and functions, a lot of these responsibilities are being outsourced to the local government. So the central government really comes into play when basically shits hit the fan. And in this case, a lot of people lost their money, they can't withdraw their money, and some of it might be life savings that people are dependent on. So of course, people have to step in, but I think that being said, you need to give time for this sort of redress and time for people to investigate. Even arguably the world's most efficient police system like in Singapore, you need to give the police force some time to investigate and to go into the details and to really see who to hold accountable for. And not just a quick 1 week investigation and not, hey guys, this is a scapegoat and then we close the case. I would believe that everybody wish to go down to the root of the problem and hold people accountable. So that's why these sort of functions and these sort of processes takes time. So the face-off lasted for several hours until after 11 AM, where rows of security officers suddenly charged up the stairs and clashed with protesters, who threw bottles and other small objects at them. So if you were to actually watch the video, you can see that there was this violent combat between the protesters and of course all these so-called quote-unquote security officers. What I don't understand is, if you were to reflect back upon the previous big protests that happened sometime last year, essentially because of Evergrande and this entire property bubble, essentially they called in the police force. Everybody was uniformed and you know who is the real deal. In this instance, I'm not too sure why they called in security officers and their only identification is by wearing white. I'm highly skeptical of what's happening behind the scenes, and I don't know who essentially called these security officers. If they were protesting outside a central bank, which is the People's Bank of China, PBOC should have protocols and SOPs, standard of procedures, to maybe call up the government, to maybe call up the police officers or somebody else that's responsible to manage the protest itself. And not this quote-unquote security officers that I don't even know which contractors that they even contracted to come in. So of course, there are certain grievances of why would government employees beat us up? We are only ordinary people asking for our deposits back. We did nothing wrong. Exactly, I share the same sentiments. So late on Sunday night, the Henan banking regulators issued a statement saying that relevant departments were speeding up efforts to verify information on customer funds on the fourth rural bank, which is why investigations take time. So the protest comes at a politically sensitive time for the ruling Communist Party, just months before its leader Xi Jinping is expected to seek an unprecedented third term at a key meeting this fall. So this is essentially a political embarrassment for Xi, and I totally and fundamentally agree. Which is why I'm under the assumption that the central government is not taking this issue lightly and just trying to brush it off. There's a core problem here, and they need to get to the root cause of the problem, and this is a political embarrassment for the entire administration. So Henan authorities are under tremendous pressure to stop the protests, but depositors remain undeterred. As the issues drag on, many have become ever more desperate to recover their savings. And once people are desperate, people do desperate things, and when violent combats come into play, it can be argued who's at fault, but and I'm not here to attribute the root cause of the violence. If you're not on the ground, you don't know who started throwing things, so I'll reserve my comments on that front. So moving into the bank run specifically, this was actually reported back in June of 2022. So small banks in China are running into trouble, savers could lose everything. So the trouble began in April when 4 banks in Henan suspended cash withdrawals. In China, local banks are only permitted to obtain deposits from their home customer base, but authorities say that third-party platforms were used to acquire funds from depositors outside the region. So the national banking regulators have accused a major shareholder of the 4 banks to illegally attracting money from savers. So Henan New Fortune Group, a shareholder of the 4 village banks, has illegally absorbed the public funds through internal and external collusion, the use of third-party platforms and fund brokers. And if this alleged claim was true, you have to take people to task and set an example out of them to prevent and deter such things from happening again in future. So the runs on small Chinese banks have become more frequent in recent years, and some have accused of financial improprieties or corruption. Essentially, many savers have had enough. Late last month, hundreds of depositors travelled to Zhengzhou, the capital of Henan, to protest outside the office of the banking regulators and to demand their money back, to no avail. Another protest was planned in June, but as the depositors arrived in Zhengzhou, they were stunned to find that their health codes had turned red, according to 6 people. So anyone with a red code, usually assigned to people infected with COVID or deemed by authorities to be at high risk of infection. And if this alleged changing or manipulation of the health code to prevent protests really took place, then I think somebody in the local government has to pay. And the interesting thing is, as you watch the story develop, a lot of all these quote-unquote protesters that lost their money in this, investment scheme, banking scheme or depositing scheme are demanding the regulators to get their money back. But if you got scammed, it's true that the regulators are at some sort of fault here because they need to strengthen their system. But if you were to look at it from the perspective of the regulators, they are in a huge dilemma. And having such scams of deposits or banking scams, etc., is not a China problem. Singapore had our fair share, which I'll be sharing later on, about this idea of a Ponzi scheme. And I think in the crypto space itself, and even in the US, there are such problems. Things like crypto lender Celsius pauses withdrawal due to extreme market conditions. Voyager temporarily suspend all trading withdrawals and deposits. So it's not really a China problem, even though I know a lot of people hope that this is a China problem. Even in Singapore, we had our own fair share of a Ponzi scheme back in the early 2000s. I'll share with you at the later part of this video and you'll see what I mean. So there's actually a little comfort to the bank's customer. Deposits up to 500,000 yuan, which is 75,000 USD, are guaranteed in the event of bank failures. So quoting one of the victims, we were told by the banks that the deposit products were legal and that they were protected by the deposit insurance scheme. We just want to get our money back. And I think I want to make a huge distinction here. We were told by the banks, whether the bank is the central government bank, which is People Banks of China, ICBC or whatever out there, compared to the small rural banks. There are 2 different banks, by the way. Don't mix concepts together and say that, oh, the Chinese government is essentially scamming people money. Like I said, I'm willing to bet $10,000, $20,000, or even $30,000 and say that, hey, a lot of all these state-owned big banks out there, by hook or by crook, even if they have to kneel down to the government and to ask them to print money to allow for smooth withdrawal process, they will do that. They wouldn't be banning withdrawal and stuff like that. So I would fundamentally believe that it's these rural banks that had some liquidity crisis or some sort of problems that are illegal in the backdrop of this entire situation. So in early 2021, Beijing already banned banks from selling deposit products via third-party online platforms, fearing that the rapid expansion of the fintech sector could increase risk in the wider financial system. The People's Bank of China called such practices illegal financial activities. So why were small local banks in Henan apparently ignoring the ban and raising the deposits from savers? Like someone who lived on the other side of the country. Exactly my question. I have no idea. So in the Henan's case, various state-run media are reporting that the deposit products were sold via platforms affiliated with or owned by giants of China's tech scene such as Baidu and JD. Luckily, Alibaba and Tencent is not in the picture, but I wouldn't even be surprised if they are, essentially because they have a whole host of portfolio companies and it's so hard to keep track of everyone. So the central government regulators seem to be incapable of enforcing those regulations aimed at preventing this kind of bank run from occurring. So the core problem is that China's financial system simply expanded far too fast relative to the size of the economy over the previous decade. And I fundamentally agree. And to just circle back and to finish the entire illustration and to draw the bigger picture for those of you who are invested in Alibaba, Tencent, etc., the entire crackdown onto Ant Group, this is one of the core reasons, and this was the same reason cited by the regulators and the government. They are not stopping you from expansion, they just want an orderly expansion and they don't want things like this to happen. Think about it, this is just 4 rural banks. And if because of Ant Group's technological prowess, where they keep stacking up this sort of inherent risk to the financial system, what happens if it implodes the entire big banks, etc.? The Chinese government will have to bail them out. And that's the worst case scenario. We don't want something like the 08 thing to happen again in the distant future. So whether you believe that the crackdowns are due or not, I leave it up to you to make your assessment. So compared with big banks, they are more reliant on deposits for funding. Many of them offered high interest rates to attract commercial and interbank deposits. I want to highlight this again. Many of them offer high interest rates to attract commercial and interbank deposits. The funny thing is, if you were to think about it, if you were to just deposit a lot of your money in the main banks out there, or even just deposit your money in WeChat Pay or even in Alipay, it's quite hard to imagine a day where ICBC stops your withdrawal or where Alipay tells you that, hey, sorry, your money that you parked with us here, we can't return you. Apologies. I would say that there's a possibility of such big institutions landing themselves in this sort of troubles, but I'll put the probability close to zero. So now, let me give you the scenario. If a part of the population decides to take a higher level of risk because XYZ Bank, which is a rural bank, not state affiliated, maybe it's just a small local bank, says that I'm promising you a higher interest rate, deposit it with me, and you decided to take up the deal, and something happens to the local bank and then you go up to the regulator and say that, hey, why are you not doing your job? What do you expect the regulator and the government to do? And let me say that this is not a new occurrence. It's exactly playing out in all the centralized platforms where they are promising you like what, 20% APY and allow you to go through staking and whatever. And when the system imploded on itself, people are taking up to the US regulators and saying that, hey, why are you not doing anything about it? You make your own assessment. So what's your own assessment of the grander scheme of things that's transpiring in China thus far? Leave in the comment section down below, and of course, remember to help smash the like button on the way out. And last but not least, I just wanted to circle back to something that happened in Singapore, where everybody is extremely proud of our regulators because we have a very strict mandate. We want to protect the normal consumers in Singapore, and that has always been the impression that a lot of international investors have, which is why we managed to attract so much funds. But this was reported by Straits Times, which is a state-owned media in Singapore as well, the rise and fall of Sunshine Empire. And this essentially happened in the early 2000s. Long story short, they are basically a Ponzi scheme. So individuals poured in thousands of dollars to buy quote-unquote lifestyle packages, which they believe could earn them monthly cash payouts amounting to several times what they've put in. But in truth, the Sunshine Empire had no legitimate profit-generating mechanism and relied on money from new investors to pay old ones in a classic Ponzi scheme. And they managed to swindle nearly $190 million. At the end of the day, in order for such elaborate Ponzi schemes, investment schemes, bank schemes, etc. to come into fruition, it voices down to one word. And that word is greed. With that, I'll see you in the next video, but more importantly, I will see you on the moon. Goodbye!